I thought I'd try to follow up some of the things I was saying yesterday or a couple days ago about the problem of our relations as real as things. I think part of this is maybe the issue of differences. I shot some videos on this, early on when I first got on YouTube, looking at Gregory Bateson's work. Bateson had done a lot of really very interesting work on the problem of differences and where do you locate a difference. So, if I have two items and I try to suggest that they're similar, well, I can usually identify a property and suggest that that property is similarly held by each of the item. But if I say that one object is different than another object, I can't locate the difference between them in any one of them. It's an abstract comparison, and yet the difference is something that is experienceable. And so there does seem to be an interconnection. Now, I think part of the problem that was precipitated in the earlier video is that people get caught in a kind of representationalism where they think that the world is out there and then the mind represents it. I think that people struggle with the idea that the world itself is open through a network of interconnected senses. That is, each sense, and by that I mean touch, taste, sight, hearing, smell, these have their own spatiotemporal bearing. They open fields that then the brain consciousness, it integrates in a tacit way that we only experience the product of the integration. But in fact, the spatiotemporal field of each sense is quite different. That is, the space and time of the eye is very, very different than the space and the time of the ear, which is very different than the space and the time of the hand. Each organ makes room and a kind of time in its own way, and it's the calibration across all of those different sense organs that I think allow us to create something like this notion of a thing over there. I mean, the relations that I guess are there that we don't like. I was sort of posing this problem of, well, if the relations aren't there independent of people, but we're not making them up either, that is, how are we constituting them? Well, I think we're constituting those relations first through an interharmony and an interconnectedness of the concordance or lack of concordance between the sensory fields of the different senses, and then that is, I guess, judged by the mind. Numbers, would be a great example. I've heard some people try to suggest that numbers are seen. I don't know. McLuhan would say that numbers are a tactile sense. That actually, blindfolded person can feel number, at least rudimentary numbers, a couple of numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The notion of zero certainly isn't visible, and the notion of I guess, really abstract concepts, square root of -1, not visible at all. Some of these are more patterns that I guess that we recognize. Now, patterns are also something that I think are similarly related to some of these problems in that I think one of the arguments would be that there really are no patterns in space. There are only patterns in time. And what we call patterns in space are basically the assumption of the wandering eye that's able to retain while it awaits a glance that sweeps over a field and then recognizes the pattern that supposedly was there. But again, time is required in vision. It's not like vision is a little window onto things there. Okay, so I think part of the problem that I'm maybe trying to address isn't some super fantastical windy poops and fairy dust about anything like that. It's this issue of what are the problems of reductive materialism when people try to suggest that everything is basically one substance? What they're doing is they're denying the difference of the senses. They're denying the qualitative properties that emerge through interactions and through differences. Now, I think one of the examples that I'll probably just leave here with, I'm trying to keep it short here today, is this issue of differences, and see, language itself is nothing but differences. That is a word, and this is at phonemic levels, morphemic level. I mean, it happens at many levels throughout discourse. It's the way words differ from one another. I mean, not only do we have words that are defined by, not being their opposite, they're polar words, that oftentimes we could say all moral words are polar words. And I would challenge people here, right, if you want to have a challenge for the day, try to think of an example of a moral word that isn't polar, that isn't partly defined by its opposite. And so by a moral word, I would mean like good, evil, right, wrong, up, down, words that have possibility loaded into them are moral words. And like example would be possibility as opposed to impossible, or even expensive and cheap. I mean, it's funny, there's some words that you wouldn't even notice that they're smuggled in being only defined by their opposite. It's not necessarily like cup. Okay, now cup, there isn't such a thing as an anti-cup or an uncup, but there is a glass or a can or a jar, and we do have categorical differences. I think the more that people could understand that language is a system that has been made of nothing but differences, and to that extent, it's a kind of, bootstrapping whereby people have, created a kind of gossamer upon air that has enough structure to allow people to live in it. Um, it's not things. Words are not things. Words are collections of differences, and those differences are very real, even though they're not locatable within the empirical world. Part of the problem, I guess, is not recognizing the different spatiotemporal characteristics of the different senses. And I think this is part of this issue when people try to suggest that space and time can't be separated. Okay, that's right. If you want to say that anything has dimensions and we have to deal with the dimensions of the object, including time, so there is a fourth dimension, right? I think that that's going to be okay, but then there have to be many kinds of time. Time itself is not one thing. Now, if we're going to say that time is more than one thing, or at least there are different kinds of time, it seems like again, this overly reductive, it's all just one substance or it's one kind of thing, seems just too simplistic or too naive to deal with the ranginess of it as we actually experience it. Well, I guess one more thing is, I remember when I was young, I once imagined that one could argue that in order for change to be registered, there would have to be something that was unchanging. I used to think that there would have to be something there that stands unchanged in order to see all the change around it. And then I think as I aged, I realized that no, that's really not the case at all. What you really need is different rates of change intersecting. And if you have different rates of change intersecting, it appears as if there are things there. Right? John Dewey has a wonderful line where he says, where communication occurs, events turn into objects, things with a meaning. The world is all eventful, but language, because it deals in differences as things, we deal in a world of objects. I mean, there's so many different examples that could be given of that, but the world isn't a thing. If anything, it's an event. Even a number. A number relies upon a counting. To imagine that the number is there independent of the counting kind of confuses how it requires an event in order to intersect with another event to give a manifestation of an object. Objects appear only where events intersect. You can try to think about it. Where communication occurs, events turn into objects, things with a meaning. Did you ever wonder where your lap goes when you stand up? We've created this thing called a lap. A lap is really an event. Okay, thanks.